I'm Dave Hackett, president of the Harpswell Historical Society. And this is a joint venture between the Historical Society and the Harpswell Heritage Land Trust. So would you all introduce yourselves before we start?
Sure, I'm Kara Douglas. I live right up the road. I did a project working in partnership with the Land Trust. We were contributors to an anthology of poetry that assigned writers to different lands all around the state of Maine. And I did some writing at the first preserve. Past year.
Hi everyone, my name is Lindy Magnus. I'm the Outreach and Education Director at the Land Trust. And so yeah, I got to work closely with Dave and Katie to put this event together.
Hi, I'm Acadia, and I live like right up the road, and I go to the Wild School in Yarmouth, and I volunteer at the Harpswell Land Trust.
I'm Dave Sparks. I grew up here in Harpswell. I was born in '61. I moved away for a while, but I've been back for some time now, and I've gotten involved with the Historical Society, and I've loved every minute of it, and so I'm always happy to do anything like this. It helps bring the town together.
Well, I'm a local history guy, so you're going to have to endure a little bit of local history before we start. Now, this building is 18 years older than these United States. This was built by Englishmen, not Americans. And a lot of the graves out back here are Englishmen, not Americans. There were no Americans when this was built. Now, King George claimed all the pine trees in Maine bigger than 27 inches for the Royal Navy. It's illegal to own a board bigger than 27 inches. This is where the deacons of the church sits. This is the church elders sitting in this pew here. And the board underneath them is 29 3/4. We are all good Englishmen, but. And one of the stories that's passed down, and it's kind of fun, the building next door to us was known as Mr. Tad's Tavern in colonial times. And it was known that the parishioners might fortify themselves to the cold and any stray germs by visiting the tavern. And on one occasion, Pastor Mead was the last one to come back in. And as he came through the vestibule door, he was noticed to swagger a bit. Deacon Andrew Dunning, the box pew over there, jumped up and transfixed him with a stare and held him till he was wont to sober a bit. And at that point in time, I believe he went up into the pulpit and preached hellfire and brimstone for at least 3 hours. Now, it's not very warm in here tonight, but the stove there is a modern invention of town. There was no stove in here in colonial times. The only heat you had was little metal boxes called foot warmers. And the sexton of the church was required to keep a fire of maple outside for coals. And you could go out and refill them a few times, but if it was 0 outside, it would be 5 degrees in here. And imagine being in here for a sermon that lasted 3 hours. Now, box pews around the edges, they used to be in the center section as well. And part of the reason for box pews is families would huddle together to try and keep from freezing to death. And it's a very different time now. This building is a testament to many, many, many generations of Harpswell people. That it exists at all is one thing, but that it exists in this form is really quite special. The building belongs to the town of Harpswell and is operated by the Harpswell Historical Society. And it's been that way since 1987 when the new town office was built. And I've been caretaker of the building ever since. And I've been bringing people into this building for more than half my life. And 99.9% of the people, when they walk through the door into here, they say a version of one word, and that word is wow. It is that kind of place. It takes you back in time. Imagine the amount of life that's been here. Births, deaths, wars, every imaginable thing, every imaginable emotion. So this is a pretty special place, a very special place in our town. So, without further ado, let's start.
Awesome, let's go. Well, welcome again, everyone. So as Dave was sharing, this is a really special place to celebrate, and that's in this immediate space that we're in. But also the theme of all of the stories tonight is celebrating this special place that is Harpswell, and also celebrating the things that bring us together, maybe across differences, across generations, and all sorts of things like that. So Acadia and I are going to kick off the night with our first story, and it is called Turtle in a Tree, and it is by Nisha Hudson. So we will get started. And this one of those ones might be about coming together. What do you see?
A turtle in a tree.
A turtle in a tree?
I'm sure.
That's impossible. Turtles don't climb trees. Squirrels climb trees. It must be a squirrel.
Look right there.
I see a long, bushy, squirrely tail.
I saw a round, lumpy, turtly shell.
Okay then, where's the water? Turtles must live in the water.
Maybe it's on vacation.
Ah, it's throwing acorns!
Turtles love acorns.
What do we think? No, they don't. It's not a turtle. It's a squirrel.
It's not a squirrel, it's a turtle.
Squirrel!
Turtle!
Squirrel!
Turtle!
Rustle, rustle, rustle. What do we hear in the tree? Bloop. If you can't see over there, there is indeed a squirrel that has hopped out of the tree. We're both looking at the squirrel.
I was wrong.
That's okay. Thunk! We have a turtle shell that has also fallen out of the tree. We're still confused and curious. Kibbles and biscuits, there was a turtle in that tree after all. You were right this whole time.
We were both right, and we were both wrong. Perhaps there is more than one side to every tree.
Is that a squirrel in a pond? The end.
Okay, this is called A Mess of Clams by Robert P.T. Coffin. He grew up on Sebastian Island, he graduated Bowdoin College, and he won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry in 1936. The fields are high with all the winter's snows, but somewhere there is cawing and glad crows, and ice upon bare birches feels the sun, and twinkles and is starting in to run. An old, old man with no tooth in his head is walking fast, and spring is in his tread, as he wades the snowdrifts of his farm, his clam hoe and his clam basket on his arm. Down below him all his bay is white, but out towards sea the dark place overnight has widened, and blue waves are twinkling clear above the first and best clams of the year. The March sun burns upon the man's bent bones. His wife is lying where the slanting stones are hidden by the winter, and all his sons are begotten and have begot new ones. He is alone, but he can go and bring his mess of clams home in his 80th spring, as he would in his 20th one, and he can pick his dinner up out of the sea just as well as any man alive, and think of things like young men fit to wive. His head is high and handsome as a ram's, and life is good and tastes of sweet young clams.
All right, so our next story comes from the suggestion of Heather Logan over at Cundy's Harbor Library. So I bring you Island Fisherman. Danny spent every summer at Graham Nellie and Gramp Jess's whitewashed Cape home on Bailey Island, Maine. His growing footsteps had discovered the island's secrets. The garnet crystals peeking out of the black rocks of Abner Point, the final resting place of an old Indian chief near the spring, and how to always catch shiny mackerel off of Abner's Wharf. These were the pleasures of his childhood. Now he was 12. This year he would work for Gramp aboard his lobster boat, the Nellie B. He would be Gramp's sternman or helper, catching lobsters in the waters off Bailey Island. After settling in, Gramp wasted no time in telling Danny he had a special treat for him. Now that you're grown enough to stern for me, Danny, he said, it's time you had some lobster traps of your own. After you stern for me a while, I'll give you some of mine. Danny was delighted. He could have his own lobstering number and his own traps with his own trap tags on them and his own special buoy colors. Oh, what color should I have my buoys be? Wondered Danny. The next morning, as the sun peeked over Mackerel Cove, Danny and Gramp walked to Abner's Wharf on the island's ancient stone pier. Abner's was the home of Glenn's Lobsters, a lobster buying business. Danny could hear the activity at the wharf long before he could see it. Lobster boats roared to life, and the lobster fishermen shouted at each other in good-natured banter. The wharf on this summer day was like a canyon. Stacked high overhead to the right were gray wooden lobster crates with frayed rope handles awaiting transport to the lobster buying station. To the left, a white mountain of salt used for preserving bait was piled high between two stacks of clean traps. Straight ahead were moving blurs of sturdy men in bright orange oilskins, tall black rubber boots, and baseball caps. They energetically shoveled bait into turquoise totes and dragged the totes down the ramp to the waiting lobster boats. The lobsterman shouted hello to Danny and Gramp, introducing his new sternmen to cousins Walter, George, Ryan, John, and Bobby. Cousins? Danny gasped. Danny didn't know that any of these fishermen were his cousins. Fortified with the latest news and some goodies for the day, Gramp and Danny headed the Nellie B out of Mackerel Cove. As they went by Don Rogers' wharfs, Danny saw the strangest sight. Yellow, white, blue, and green rectangular boxes stacked next to the old wooden lobster traps. Attached to these boxes were coils of rope, and to each coil of rope was attached a blank red, black, and fluorescent yellow buoy painted with Don's buoy pattern. Danny shouted to Gramp over the roar of the engine, "What are those boxes, Gramp?" Gramp puffed, "Oh, those are some fancy new wire traps bought from a company down east. They don't make them out of saplings and laths like we've always done." Danny stared at the beautiful and mysterious wire traps. "Cool," said Danny. "Wood ones are better," Gramp said indignantly. Gramp continued to head the Nellie B out to the open ocean near Halfway Rock. He checked the tattered paperback notebook in which his father had written the location of each and every buoy. On the latter pages, Gramp had written a few sites of his own. Halfway Rock, named because it was halfway between Small Point and the Portland Headlight, was a bulge of rock topped with an ancient lighthouse. It was rough out there. The randy waters of the Atlantic Ocean seemed undecided about associating with the meek currents of Casco Bay. Danny and Gramp were in the middle of this clash, getting tossed and bumped. Gramp loved it. After hauling a few traps, Gramp glanced at Danny. Danny's face had taken a greenish tint and his legs seemed to wobble. "I guess we could set a few in the shoal water over by Giant Staircase," said Gramp. Danny was glad they were headed back to the quiet bay. Though the mystery and isolated beauty of the lighthouse intrigued him, his stomach felt a bit queasy and his knees ached from banging against the rails of the boat in the heavy seas. Danny looked down into the water. Great schools of tiny silver fish hurried on their way. An expansive pink anemone beckoned to tiny sea creatures. Danny dropped crumbs of his tuna fish sandwich into the busy crabs who scurried sideways along the ocean bottom. All too soon, it was time to get back to work. Danny was getting weary. The wind was picking up and the tide had shifted, and Gramp said, "I can smell a storm coming. We'll have to haul a few more. Tomorrow's another day." Finally, they headed home to Mackerel Cove to sell their lobsters. Once inside the cove, they headed toward the floating lobster car, which was the lobster buying station for Glenn's Lobsters. 200 pounds of lobsters, Gramp said. "Not bad for this early in the season." Danny didn't hear him. He was looking over at the glittering wire traps on Don Rogers' wharf. During dinner time, Danny talked over his wonderful day with Graham Nellie and Gramp Jess. He talked of the cousins he'd met at Abner's Wharf, the fisherman's gossip at the lobster village, and the clutch of ducklings he'd seen off an island. and the wire lobster traps he'd seen at the wharf. "Gramp, I'd like to have wire traps," said Danny excitedly. "We've always used wooden ones," Gramp said, stirring his chowder. "I saved 5 for you." "But I'd like to try wire traps," said Danny. "Why?" asked Gramp. "Because they're shiny and they have lots of colorful gizmos on them, and because they're new, they're different, and they're cool," said Danny, catching his breath. Gramp could see he was not going to win this argument. Youngsters, they think they know everything, thought Gramp. The old ways are best. He said to Danny, "Okay, we'll try them, but you'll have to pay for them yourself out of your sternman's wages. I think the guys buy them from Friendship Trap down east. When you've saved enough, we'll call and order them. Maybe they'd be better for you. They're supposed to be lighter, and that'll make it easier for you to handle, but they won't catch many lobsters." Each day, Danny hauled and baited his traps and banded his lobsters. Hauled, baited, and banded. He was paid in lobsters. After selling his lobsters, he paid for his share of the bait and supplies and saved the rest of his money to buy wire traps. Danny decided on yellow, orange, and green for his buoy colors and painted his 5 after work. He painted the buoys with the same pattern that his great-grandfather had used. Finally, the day came when he earned enough to order his traps. Since his favorite color was yellow, he decided to order his traps in yellow wire. In a few days, they would arrive by truck to Bailey Island. After prepping the ropes and baiting the traps, it was finally time. One by one, Danny proudly shoved his traps off the stern of the Nellie B and flung his rope and buoy overboard. Just a few feet away, Gramp lowered his wooden traps. It was mid-July and the lobsters were beginning to come in. Gramp said that they'd go for a 2-night set. It seemed like a long time to Danny. Finally, it was the day he could haul his own brand new traps. The sun was out and the water was flat and calm as they headed to sea. Danny spotted a splash of orange and yellow in the ripples ahead. He stretched out his gaff and grabbed his first buoy. He ran the rope through the hauler and brought the first trap aboard the Nellie B. Even after just 2 days, the sea creatures had made themselves at home. In the trap, Danny found 2 starfish, a big codfish, 4 undersized lobsters, 3 crabs, 2 keeper lobsters. Danny threw the undersized lobsters back into the sea to grow some more, banded the 2 keeper lobsters, and pulled the starfish off the wire traps, and stuffed the crabs into the parlor of the trap, where the lobsters could munch on them after sampling the bait. He wrestled the codfish into the lobster tank. Gramp can make a tasty chowder out of this fish, he thought. He baited the trap and pushed it overboard. Excitedly, he hauled his next 4 traps. It was just like treasure hunting. More lobsters, more sea creatures, and there was always some sort of surprise, even if it was only a lowly periwinkle. Danny helped Gramp haul his 5 neighboring traps, but something odd was happening. Danny's traps had more lobsters in them than Gramp's did. Why would that be? Gramp had been fishing at Pond Island Ledges for 55 years, and his family before him for another 40 years. Gramp knew the waters and the ways of the sea. What was different? Why would one bunch of traps set in the same place catch more lobsters than another one? Beginner's luck, Gramp called it. Day after day, Danny's traps had more lobsters in them than Gramp's. Gramp never said a word. He hauled his traps and baited them, just like he always had. Danny was puzzled. Was there something special about the wire traps? Did the lobsters like them better? Why? Danny decided to ask around. Shane said that the wooden traps were too buoyant and started to float off the ocean floor like boats. John said that the lobsters can't get out easily. That was all he said. Don said that the wooden traps can sometimes go sour, so lobsters don't like to use them after they've been used for a few years. Whatever the reason, each trap of Danny's had more pounds of lobsters per trap than did his grandfather's. September came all too soon, and with it came the end of the summer. Together, for the last time this season, Danny and Gramp headed to Pond Island Ledges to haul traps. After Danny hauled his 5 wire traps, he packed his lobsters into a bucket with seaweed to take them home. Sadly, he piled his wire traps on the stern of the Nellie B. At high tide, Gramp and Danny dropped the traps onto the flooded Mackerel Cove beach. They put the Nellie B on the mooring and walked home to wait for the tide to change. At low tide, they returned with Gramp's old island truck, backed it onto the beach, and loaded the traps. The truck rattled its way down the potholed sandy road to Graham and Gramp's house. They stacked the traps in the yard next to the house. In November and December, when lobstering ended for the season, Gramp would add his wooden traps to the pile. They would sit there through the winter snows and spring rains until lobster season began again. Danny packed his suitcase. Summer vacation was over. He looked down at his hands. They were calloused and tanned, his forearms muscled from lifting heavy traps and dragging totes of bait. Danny thought of all he had learned this summer. As an island child, he learned the secrets of the land. As an island fisherman, he learned the secrets of the sea and about lobsters and what they like to eat and where they hide and how to catch them. He stood next to Gramp Jeffs and said, "Thanks, Gramp, for all you've taught me this summer." Gramp wrapped his arm around Danny's shoulder, smiled, and said, "Thank you, Danny, for all you've taught me." Danny looked puzzled. Gramp continued, "Next year, I'm gonna fish them wire traps."
This next story is called The Coming of Blue Sky. It's a Wabanaki legend written by Joseph Nicolau. Joseph Nicolau was born February 15, 1827. His father died when he was 10, so he had to become a man of the family at an early age. As a Native American, he was able to attend public schools, which was very, very unusual. His gift for oration and writing skills enabled him to write for local newspapers later in his life. The Coming of Glooskap. Glooskap, the man from nothing, first called the minds of his red children to his coming into the world, when the world contained no other man, in flesh, but himself. When he opened his eyes, lying on his back in the dust, his head toward the rising of the sun, and his feet towards the setting of the sun, the right hand pointing toward the north, and his left hand pointing towards the south. Having no strength to move any part of his body, yet the brightness of the day revealed to him all the glories of the whole world. The sun was at its highest, standing still, and beside it was the moon without motion, and the stars were in their fixed places, while the firmament was in its beautiful blue. While yet his eyes were held fast in their sockets, he saw all that the world contained. Beside what the region of the air revealed to him, he saw the land, the sea, mountains, lakes, rivers, and the motion of the waters. And in it he saw the fishes. On the land were the animals and beasts, and in the air the birds. In the direction of the rising sun he saw the night approaching. While the body clung to the dust, he was without mind, and the flesh without feeling. At that moment the heavens were lit up with all kinds of bright colors most beautiful. Each color stood by itself. And in another moment every color shot a streak into the other, and soon all the colors intermingled, forming a beautiful brightness in the center of the heavens over the front of his face. Nearer and nearer came the brightness toward his body, until it got almost to a touching distance. And a feeling came into his flesh. He felt the warmth of the approaching brightness, and he fell into a deep sleep. The wind of the heavens fanned his brow, and the sense of seeing returned to him. But he saw not the brightness he beheld before, but instead of the brightness a person like unto himself standing at his right hand. And the person's face was towards the rising of the sun. In silence he raised his right hand in the direction of the rising sun, passed it from thence to the setting of the sun, and immediately a streak of lightning followed the motion of his hand, from one side of the earth to the other. Again he raised his right hand to the south, passing it to the north, and immediately another streak of lightning followed the motion of his hand, Immediately after the passing of the lightning over his body, a sense of thought came into him, and the Great Spirit answered his thought, saying these words: "Arise from thy bed of dust, and stand on thy feet. Let the dust be under thy feet, and as thou believest, thou shalt have strength to walk." Immediately strength came into him, and he arose to his feet, and stood beside the Great Spirit. And this the Great Spirit moved, and turned half around toward his right hand, facing the sun. Lifting both hands and looking up, he said, "Go thy way," and immediately the whole heavens obeyed. The sun, the moon, and all the stars moved toward the setting of the sun, the night coming slowly toward their standing, when the Great Spirit sending up his voice, saying, "Let us make man in our own image," and immediately dropped his two hands and cast his eyes upon the land, and moved halfway around again toward his right hand, facing the setting of the sun, and passed his right hand from the north to the south. The lightning followed the motion of his hand from north to south, and again passed his hand from the setting of the sun to the rising of the sun. And when the lightning came upon the night which was approaching, it disappeared. Okay, get one more. Where is it? This next one is called Maine. It's written by Philip Booth. He was born in New Hampshire, but he lived in Cascade, Maine, taught at Bowdoin College, and has been called Maine's clearest poetic voice. Maine. When old cars get retired, they go to Maine. Pick his cows and back lots off the blacktop, east of Bucksport, down the washboard from Penobscot to Castine. They graze behind framed barns, a Ford-turned tractor, Hudson's chopped into half-ton trucks, and Chevy panels jacked up, tireless, geared to saw a cord of wood. Old engines never die, not in Maine, where men grind valves the way their wives grind axes, ring jobs burned out down the turnpike, still make revolutions, turn marine. If Hardscrabble Hill makes her knock, Maine rigs the water jack salt. A man can fish forever on converted sixes, and for his mooring sink a V8 block. When fishing's poor, a man traps what he can. Even when a one-horse hearse from Bangor fades away, the body still survives. Painted lobster, baited off Route 1, with home preserves and Indian knives, she'll net a parlor full of Fords and Holland transient Cadillacs like crabs. Maine trades and staying power, not shiftless drivers.
Alright, thanks Dave. So next, I'm going to bring the story of the whale in Mole's Cove. So some of you may remember this, have your own version of this story to tell and to share, but we will be reading from Jane's lovely book, and I will do my best to share the illustrations with you because they are just gorgeous. So this is the whale in Mole's Cove. Mole's Cove is one of many small harbors and inlets in the town of Harpswell on the Maine coast. It is cold and wind-tossed in winter, but warm summer sun finds it glittering with blue wavelets and full of boats. In June, schools of pogies swim into the cove to feed. Fishermen then close off the mouth of the cove with a long seine net. The top edge of the net is held up by floats, and the bottom is held down by lead weights that rest on the floor of the cove. A door in the net about 8 feet deep allows the fishing boats to enter and leave. Trapped behind the net, the pogies spend their summer in the cove. They have plenty to eat and room to move about. Each morning, a school of them are netted up and sold down to the local lobster fishermen for bait. One quiet day at the beginning of July, a whale appeared in Mole's Cove. There she swam inside the long Seine net that closed off the cove from the deep ocean. Perhaps she'd been chasing a big school of pogies that swam into the cove. Now, both the pogies and the whale were in the cove. People were astounded. A whale right here in Lowell's Cove? They told all of their friends. More and more people came by boat and by car. They all wanted to see the humpback whale. She was even on television. She was a young humpback whale, only 1.5 years old. Still growing, she was already 30 feet long. Her sleek body was glossy blue-black, and her graceful flippers were a lovely white. Everyone thought she was so big and so beautiful. People came in the afternoons and evenings to see her and hear her blow when she surfaced for air. They could watch her quite well, even from the shore. In the early mornings, the cove was peaceful. The silver-pink water lay smooth and calm. Silent boats slept at their moorings. Most of the people in the cottages were still asleep in their beds. The whale, wide awake, fed on the pogies trapped inside the net. She would lunge up, her mouth full of many, many pogies and gallons of water. Then she'd push all of the water out through her strainer-like baleen plates. The water would flow out through the plates, but the pogies would be caught behind the baleen. She'd swallow them up and then swim after more. Since humpback whales only eat during the summer half of the year, this young whale had a lot of eating to do. She needed to eat 1,200 pounds of pogies each day. Maybe the cove was a good place for a growing whale after all. It was full of fish. Whale experts from the New England Aquarium came to make sure that the whale was all right. They were especially concerned because humpback whales are an endangered species. Was it good for her to live in such a small cove, they wondered? Was she healthy? She looked thin to them. The experts knew she'd left her mother less than a year ago. Young whales often have difficulty catching enough to eat. Maybe she needed the pogies trapped inside the Seine net. They watched her feeding. She certainly seemed to be getting plenty of food. Some of the whale watchers said they'd seen a whale leave the cove, so maybe she was not actually trapped by the net. The aquarium people decided to leave her in the cove for now, but returned later to check on her. So the whale stayed inside the net in Lowell's Cove. Soon, many, many boats full of excited people were crowding in to see the whale. They didn't mean any harm, but most of these visitors did not know about whales. Some of them even tried to poke her with their oars. The weekends were the worst of all. Because of all the boats, there was not enough room for a 30-foot whale to come to surface and breathe. She might be cut by a boat's propeller. The whale was very young and very trusting. She did not know that she was in danger. Still, the whale stayed inside the net in Lowell's Cove. Many people were concerned for the health of the whale, with so many people in boats all around. Finally, a state patrolman thought of a great idea. The state could pass a special temporary law to stop people from using boats in the cove for as long as the whale stayed there. The only boats allowed in were those of the fishermen coming in to buy pogies. From then on, the whale had plenty of room. People could still watch her from the shore or from the boats outside of the cove. The whale ate pogies and played. She did all the things a young and happy humpback whale should do. She would throw herself out of the water and into the air, and then land on her back with a loud kersplash. She'd roll over on her side and flap her flippers on the water. She'd stand on her head underwater and throw up her tail and slap the water with a loud smack. When she was tired from her play, she would nap out next to the net, facing the deep, deep ocean where she came from. Once in a while, visitors who did not know about the special law paddled into the cove in their canoes and kayaks. Fascinated, they would glide up right next to the whale. The whale's friend Charlie would see them and sigh. He'd motor over in his big pokey boat and tell them to go outside the net. They always did once they understood why boats were not allowed in the cove. Three whole weeks went by. The whale ate. The whale played. And when she wasn't doing anything much, she floated next to the net, facing out to the deep, open ocean where she'd come from. The whale experts came back to check on her. She spends a lot of time looking out to sea, they said. Many people cared about the health of the whale, but she seemed happy here in Harpswell. Then, one morning, when Charlie boarded his boat, the whale did not swim up to greet him. Where was she? She wasn't feeding. Had she left the cove? No. Charlie heard a very quiet whoa from out near the net. Something was wrong. Charlie hurried over in his big pokey boat. He found the whale all tangled up in the long stem net. Charlie sped back to the dock for his crew and a skiff. They carefully edged up alongside the whale. Talking softly and calmly to her, they pulled the net away from her with long gaps. The whale didn't struggle. She let them free her. Thank goodness Charlie had found her before she drowned. After this, the whale experts realized something had to be done. There were too many hazards for a young whale in Lowell's Cove. The whale had stayed there for a month. During that time, she had eaten a lot of pogies and charmed hundreds of people with her play. But now she'd been tangled in fishing gear twice and nearly drowned, and it was time for her to go. A few people were still convinced that the whale came and went when she wanted to. If you let her out, she'll come right back, they declared. But other people wondered whether she really could leave voluntarily. Maybe when the whale seemed to be gone, she was only quietly napping out by the net and was hard to see. The whale experts listened to both sides, and then they decided that the whale should be released. Maybe she'll come back in, but maybe she won't, they said. The whale experts were concerned because they knew that all humpback whales in North America migrate south in September. This whale needed to be free to join the other whales. If she had a chance to leave, would she go? Would she come back? No one knew. The fishermen had a problem. They were afraid that they would lose all of their pogies if the net was taken down to release the whale. It was only the 1st of August, and they needed to sell pogies for another month or two. The fishermen and the whale experts talked it over. Together, they came up with a plan. Here is what they did. They waited until the whale had finished her early morning feeding. She swam out beside the net to nap. A spotter plane pilot who had been sent up to watch the pogies radioed down the good news. Most of the schools were at the head of the cove, far away from the whale. Quickly, one of the fishermen scooted behind the whale in his dory, pulling a second net across the cove. That part of the plan had worked. The pogies were all safely inside the new net. The whale was between the two nets. She woke up and swam about. She knew there were 2 nets now. So all the pogies were up here. They put a second net in, and then the whale was between the 2 nets. Next, the fishermen and the whale experts made sure no boats were outside the cove that might frighten the whale. Then, slowly and carefully, the fishermen weighted down a section of the outer net with 100-pound weights. Everyone waited, holding very still. What would the whale do? She swam up to the opening in the net. She knew something was different. Frightened, she swam away a little. But then she came back to the net. She stuck her head through the opening. Then she swam backwards and dove out of sight. What was going to happen? What would she do? Did she really want to stay in the cove? Suddenly, the whale surfaced outside the sand net. Everyone cheered. She took a big breath and dove again. The fishermen hurried to pull up the weights and let the net rise. The whale experts leaped into their boats, ready to follow the whale. They wanted to see where she would go. The whale headed straight out to sea as fast as she could swim. She breached completely out of the water and came down on her back. Kersplash! Huge splashes of ocean water glistened in the early sunlight each time she landed. Kersplash! Kersplash! Over and over again, she breached, swam, then breached again. Kersplash! 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 The young whale left all of the people and their boats and their fishing gear and the pogies in Mole's Cove far, far behind. She swam out, far out into the deep open ocean where she belonged. One of her poems from her project and then another poem as well.
We're going to do it.
This group of poems are included in a collection that has writers from all over the state of Maine through a project called Writing the Land that works with writers and land trusts all across the country. This one is called Pine Cones Bend the Pine Boughs as Travelers Walk the Trail. Heavy with green, they hang from the pines, honeyed with sap, raw with potential. A whole new generation of forest gestates, unfledged beneath their pistachio scales. When the nights lengthen, when the dry wind stirs, when frost etches the rim of the world, the scales will brown and stiffen and unshingle themselves, releasing seeds like the diaspora into the arms of the wind, onto the crackling ground. It is a long fall from pinnacle to forest floor, a long journey from homeland to fertile ground. There are footprints. Tell me where you come from, traveler. Sing me the hymns that bore you here. A little bit origin story, a little bit light on the horizon. What is it that keeps our eyes open? What roots do we unearth with every step, rainwater cooling in our footprints? In the hollows we leave behind, pine seeds gather. Some sprout and thrive. Others endure otherwise, feeding foragers, yielding to decay, the great bodies of their living ancestors standing ground, hugging ledge, holding soil, shading the path. The second one I have is from a book that was published in 1961, Home Folks of Harpswell and Other Poems by Frank Linwood Bailey. And if I read a tiny bit from the foreword about the author. The author was born in Portland, Maine, but grew up in Harpswell, a graduate of Westbrook Seminary and the University of Maine. And in the very last paragraph, there's quite a few paragraphs about the author, but in the last paragraph, it says, "You will like the author's style. His story poems are written in plain state of Maine language, and you won't need an encyclopedia in one hand and a dictionary in the other time." This is the road to Harpswell. The road that leads to Harpswell, I can see it in my dreams, and a homesick feeling grips me till every heartbeat seems to be crying out for something, some old scene I used to know, something lost among the hours that I left there long ago. It could be the star-kissed heavens of an August summer night, or the cold moon's slanting shadows when the snow lies deep and white. It could be the wild rose's fragrance on a sunny day in June, or the lazy, hazy softness of a summer afternoon. I guess I'm getting lonesome for the little old hometown and the things that just belong there like no other place I've known. The road lies there before me. I can see it oh so plain, and it softly calls me homeward, back to Harpswell down in Maine.
As a little aside, in the collection of the Hartsville Historical Society is a T-shirt that says, I survived Lowell the Whale. Now, I'll read two pieces by Kate Barnes. Kate Barnes was the first poet laureate of the state of Maine, and she lived down at Nobleboro. This is called The Barn in December. A few flakes of snow blowing like stars. The stars glisten like ice. The cold wind cuts and sings. Above my head the weather vane creaks in frozen light of the waxing moon. I push the barn door open and go in. The stalls are filled with wiggling dragons, breathing out smoke and calling for feed. I fill the pails at the pump. I carry the grain from the zinc-lined cooler. And then I climb to the mow. Heavy and soft, 6 bales of hay fly down like descending angels. The hollow nave is filled with the smell of timothy, the sound of animals chewing. I stand there for a moment enjoying their pleasure, the shelter and peace of the wooden cave. How many shingles has this barn been through? How many floors? For almost 200 years, its square timbers and thin patched walls have been standing up to the wind. They've been holding off the bitter cold, the great night of the whirring darkness. Now, once again, it is the time of the year when cold triumphs. The night rules. Every day the sun rises further away. It's hard to imagine him halting his march to the south, stopping a little, resting in the black whirlwind of space to take new form, to be born again in a barn. But the shadowy barn has seen it happen over and over, almost 200 times. The cast is still correct. The kindly horses kneel down into the straw, the hens roost in the rafters. Standing in the middle of the threshing floor, I feel the rightness of it, the calm generations of beasts, the power of the other hands on the beams, the light magic child, the shining once more from the gathered summer of hay. And this is called the logging sled, and this is from a different time than ours. I catch a ride on the logging sled and go out into the woods. As we cross the deep drifted field, I see 5 snow geese high overhead, flying almost confusedly. It's early yet. The lake is still frozen tight, with trucks on it, and the geese must be casting about for open rivers to the north of us. In the clearing, I stand up with the horses' heads and stand with them while the shed is loaded. I am gray as heavy as a badger, with the pockets of my old coat sag with carrots and books. The horses nose at my hands. The wood thumps onto the sled, and I hear blue jays squalling behind me among the pines. I smell the dampness in the air that promises spring. To whom can I say just how happy this all makes me? Thank you all for coming. I know it's a little cool in here, but we survived, most of us anyway. And we hope to do this again in a little bit more weather. Right here. So again, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.